I think I will begin by continuing with my fourth case, and then I will move over to try to take up some of the points raised by Dr. Warren. So, you remember the three different cases, ending with the one where existence is denied on the grounds that a contradiction is involved. And of course, I haven't begun to try to show that any contradiction is involved here. I just want to look at those three cases. Now, my fourth case is a rather queer one. I suppose the best example I can give of this is the example of someone who said that there were fairies. And they might begin by saying, yes, of course, there are fairies, and if you go and look at the appropriate occasion, or perhaps use other devices for detecting these creatures, you'll find them. Well and fine. If that's what the suggestion is, then it's not my fourth case. But it could happen that someone who was very keen on this belief in fairies, very committed in some way, when he was confronted with the reports of the witnesses, the photographs and so on, said, well, yeah, but fairies are rather peculiar things, you know. They don't show themselves to skeptical people, to scientists and the like. And I won't go on about this. I think it's enough to indicate that it's possible to start with some assertion about the existence of something, and then to put in various qualifications which make your assertion less and less one that could be tested at all. It's my belief, which I've argued in other places and I shall be arguing in the course of these next 4 evenings, that this often happens with religious beliefs. For instance, people affirm confidently that prayer is always answered, and then say, yes, and sometimes the answer is no. Well, when one's done that, unless one's got some method of determining that the answer is no, that provides a distinction between a no answer, saying, no, you shan't have that, and no answer at all, one has qualified one's original assertion away in such a way that it's no longer possible to test whether it's true or not. Now, in this sort of case, it seems to me that what everyone does is not in the end to say, well, I'm agnostic about fairies, but to say, there's no such thing, when it has been qualified and qualified beyond the point of testing. And it's because I think that is what one does with that sort of assertion that I think that it's appropriate to say that anyone who doesn't believe or rejects some assertion that has been qualified in that way should say he knows there are no such things, rather than that he's agnostic about it, because he's not in the situation where he's waiting for more evidence. The whole thing has been so qualified that evidence can't ever settle it, whatever one had. So much for this. These are the 4 cases which I distinguished, mainly because I wanted to make the distinction between factual impossibility and logical impossibility, but partly because I wanted to give some sort of explanation of the reasons why I'm adopting the bold atheist line rather than the modest agnostic line. Now, I think I must begin to say something about the things which Dr. Warren has raised. I think I'll deal with the last one first, partly because it's freshest in my mind and probably freshest in everyone else's mind, but also because I think I can say something useful about that very, very briefly. It's the one about my saying that I didn't think that there was an obligation on everyone to become an atheist. The reason I don't think there's an obligation on everyone to become an atheist is that it seems to me the obligation is to pursue the truth as you see it as best you can. And that's what is the obligation on all of us. And it seems to me it's perfectly possible and indeed very common for people at the end of or during the best and most honest and thorough investigation they can, to be in a position where the only thing that they honestly and conscientiously can decide in the light of the material they've considered and the way it seems to them is a quite different conclusion, namely that the only honest thing for them to do is to be theists. So, the reason I don't want to say that everyone has an obligation to agree with me is that I think everyone does have an obligation, but it's an obligation to honest inquiry, and I know that honest inquiry may lead people in very different directions. Second point, moving backwards, is these points about whether there was a baby or a woman first, or a woman or a baby. Now, I think this is an important one. The difficulty as I see it arises, and why I had some trouble about answering Dr. Warren's question, the difficulty as I see it is that the distinction between the human and not human is not, in all cases, an absolutely sharp one. That here, as I believe elsewhere in the world of evolutionary biology, there's a continuous process of development such that you can't draw a sharp line and say, well, that's the last line and this is the first something else. The position is that, of course, there are lots of cases where you can say without hesitation, it's a lion, it's a horse, it's a man, or it's not a man. But it is, it seems to me, a consequence of evolutionary theory that species shade off into one another. And hence, when you're confronted by marginal cases, you can't say, this is definitely human, or this isn't definitely human. You can say it the more extreme cases. Perhaps it would help if I used a somewhat light-hearted and unfortunately all too personally appropriate example. The distinction between people who are bald and people who are not bald. These are both vague terms. You know, it shades off into it. You go from the case of someone who's, you know, all fuzzy-wuzzy and no one would say they were bald, to the case of my much-respected supervisor, Gilbert Ryle, positively egg-like, and no doubt, but did you call that bald? But here we have a case, you know, which you go from one extreme, which is unequivocally one thing, another extreme, which is unequivocally the other, and you can go by possible stages of one more hair, and the whole idea of drawing a sharp line, or saying that if the, so to speak, population density of the hairs per square inch is, 100 per square inch, then the man's not bald. If it's 99 or less, then he's bald, or wherever you put the figure. This just doesn't work at all. And this applies wherever one has a difference of degree. And perhaps it would be helpful for me to say two things about differences of degree. One, what I take a difference of degree to be. I take it that a difference of degree is one such that between the two extremes which you say the difference of degree is a difference between is one such that there is a spectrum of actual or possible cases shading from one into the other. And the second thing, which I think it's worth saying about a difference of degree, is that a difference of degree can be enormously important. Most people, and above all, most of my students, when they've heard someone say that, the difference between human and non-human is a difference of degree, will go away and say, the professor said it was a mere difference of degree. It's not really important, or really it's the same thing. If I say nothing else of any use this evening, I think it is very worth saying that differences of degree are not all mere differences of degree. All the humanly most important differences are, in this sense, differences of degree. There may not actually be the intermediate cases in all these examples, but they are of the sort where there could be. For instance, the difference between riches and poverty, between age and youth, between sanity and insanity, and I think the difference between the unequivocally human and the highest non-human animals, these are all differences of degree. And insofar as this is right, there just can't be any answer about which in the evolutionary series was the last non-human being and which was the first fully human. It will always be a matter of, well, at this point, my goodness, there's no dispute. These are as human as you and me. And at that point, there's no dispute. If ever there were a couple of gorillas, were these. But in between, there'll be the marginal cases. Well, now we go on, steadily progressing in the order of importance to these fundamental questions about the objectivity of value. Again, I think the most useful point to begin is with a slightly adapted quotation from one of Plato's dialogues. The word that Plato actually used was piety. I want to change it to make it goodness, because piety, I think, will be confusing here. The question that was raised in the dialogue, the Euthyphro, at one point was, are the things which are good, good because God approves of those things, or is it the case that God approves of those things which are good because they are good? Are the things which are good, good because God approves of them, or does God approve of the things which are good because they are good? And if you react by saying, my goodness, that's a typical philosopher's question, you're absolutely right. It is, and it's one I've often used with boys and girls wondering if they want to study philosophy. And I said, well, if I put this to you, if after a moment of explanation of what it's about, this interests you, then philosophy would interest you. If, even after a moment of explanation, you think it's all pointless and silly, then the subject won't. Well, let me try to explain what the point is. The point is this. If you answer this question by saying, oh, the things that are good because God approves of them, you are committing yourself to saying that, in effect, it's God who not merely makes good things, but brings it about that they are good. That we are, in effect, defining goodness in terms of God's will. Now, the snag of doing this is that by this definition, you commit yourself to approving of absolutely anything that might be done by the being in question. Well, it may seem that that's all right if it's God. Think of it in another case, though. Are the things... Well, think of it, supposing you were going to define right and wrong in terms of the prescriptions of a legal system. oh, it's good because the law prescribes it, and it would be bad if the law prescribed something else. Now, if you live in a society where what the laws tell you to do are, on the whole, the things that ought to be done, and what the laws tell you not to do are, on the whole, the things that ought not to be done, it may seem to you that, oh, it would be all right to say that things are good because the law tells us to do them. But of course, that would commit you to saying, if you once accept this, that in whatever way the law was changed, whatever future law came up, it would still be right to do whatever the law commanded simply because it was the law. So, are the things that are good, good because God approves of them, or does God approve of the things which are good because they are good? If you take the first of these two options, you become committed to approving, commending as good absolutely anything that an all-powerful being might say should be done. If, on the other hand, you take the other line and say that God approves of the things which are good because they are good, the implication is that their goodness can be defined without reference to God's will. That you can know that these things are good even without knowing that God approves of them. And if that's the line you take, then the news that God favors these things is indeed good news. You now are assured how excellent it is that the Creator of the universe favors these admirable things. So, where are we? Are things that are good, good because God approves of them, or does God approve of the things which are good because they are good? This is an important question, because if you give the first of the two answers, you're committed to approving absolutely anything that an all-powerful being might say. If you take the second line, you take it that things are good and can presumably be known to be good independent of any theological knowledge. Now, how does this all bear on these questions of whether you could know that things were good independent of your knowledge of God, whether things could be good independent of your knowledge of God? Well, in this way, it is only insofar as there is an idea of goodness which doesn't have to be defined in terms of what God actually wills, that it's even going to be possible for you to recognize your God as being good. You know, if you're not defining the word in some way independent of God, then to say that your God is good is, roughly speaking, to say that what he does is what he approves of. Well, that's scarcely good news at all. It's only good news if you can be assured that what he does is good. It's not just what he's in favor of, it really is good. It's no basis for praising a God to say that what he wills is the things that he does will. It's only a basis for praising him if you can say that he does certain things which you know to be good, and how splendid this is, because you can know these things to be good without knowing this definition of the word God. So, the point I want to conclude from this sort of investigation of Plato's Euthyphro is that so far is it from being the case that if we don't know of the existence of God, we can't know anything is good. It seems to me that we can't be in a position to recognize that God is good unless we have some meaning for the word good, some knowledge of good and evil, independent of our knowledge of God.
Dr. Flew, gentlemen moderators, ladies and gentlemen. Certainly affords me a great deal of pleasure to come before you for this second speech of the evening, to reply to the speech which Professor Flew has just delivered in your presence. And I shall follow this format in this speech. I will go through his speech as I did in last time, and I think you'll find, if you listen carefully, that I will reply to my opponent's speech item by item and statement by statement, argument by argument, and then I propose to present further negative material to which he has the obligation to reply. That will further show or constitute further proof of the fact that the proposition which he has affirmed, namely, that he knows that God does not exist. You must understand that he is not merely saying that someone else has not proved that God exists, but that he himself knows that to be the case. Now, in my first speech, or in his first speech, Dr. Flew said, as a part of his speech, that men ought to be atheists. He made that as a part of his speech. I do not know that he really meant it. Later he seemed to come back and indicate that he thought only that we ought to be honest and to try to pursue the right thing. But I wonder where he obtained that information. Why ought we to be honest, Dr. Flew? Why ought we to pursue truth? Where does this obligation come from? I asked for an explanation, and I know that everyone in this audience will be asking. Remember your question. The question you answered, that before there was a human being on this earth, there was no value. Therefore, he has made clear that according to his viewpoint, and it's consistent, it is an implication of the atheistic viewpoint, that value is nothing but a function of the human mind, that it is merely the approval or disapproval of the individual or of a society. Now, friends, that simply means that the Nazis were right because they were convinced that it was the thing for them to do. In fact, I have here photostatic copies of statements where they said they thought it was their moral obligation to try to exterminate those people. Now then, Dr. Flew, you have the obligation to try to explain that. He comes back and talks about another possibility of a group of things that we might know do not exist, differentiating between factual impossibility and logical impossibility. He talks about fairies and so forth, and I anticipated that at that point he was going into the question of falsification. This is a big thing with Dr. Flew, and I anticipate his getting into it. In fact, if he doesn't hurry up and get into it, I'm going to get into it before him. Now he says, as a reply to Dr. Warren, he says, we have no obligation to become an atheist, but an obligation to pursue truth. Why? On what basis pursue truth? But now notice carefully, in this question, he has admitted obligation, moral obligation. You see, on the one hand, they want to give it to you, and on the other hand, they want to take it back. They do not want to be out here in the bald position of saying that any and everything that any person wishes to do, so long as it pleases him, if it is the rape, murder of a 5 or 6-year-old girl, if it is putting hurting little children, Jewish children, into boxcars coated with quicklime so that not only they will die, but that they will die agonizingly over a period of several days, and to work people to death as they build a road from Germany toward Russia, and to work them so hard and so agonizingly and to so degrade them that not a single one of them would survive it to form the core of a nucleus of the Jewish nation. He does not want to say that is right. He, in fact, says it is a monstrous thing. But on the other hand, his position absolutely gives him no ground for saying it. Notice that carefully. Every time he speaks, he will talk about obligation, but then he denies moral obligation, even though he has, in answering these questions, even indicated that there is such a thing as objective, real objective moral obligation. Now he raises the question of my talking about the question of a baby first or a woman first, and goes into the question of the distinction between human and non-human, and saying that there is a shade of difference here that cannot really be differentiated. Now, what he was doing with this talk about saying that there were creatures that were really neither human nor non-human was an effort to provide a basis by which he would not be under obligation to answer my question, which was first a woman or a baby. The truth of the matter is, no atheist can answer it, because every atheist must hold that every human being owes his ultimate origin to evolution, and that means back to dead matter, back to dead rocks and dirt, gas and water. back to that which had no intelligence, no life, absolutely no purpose, no power to accomplish anything of intelligence. But he cannot answer the question which was first, a woman or a baby, and so he invents a period of time in which there were supposedly, allegedly, beings that were neither human nor non-human. I deny it with every ounce of my being. Everything in this auditorium is either a human being or it isn't. This watch is either human or it isn't human. This ring on my finger is either human or it isn't human. Every object in the world is either a rock or it isn't a rock. Every object in the world either has the property of being read or it doesn't have the property of being read. I am astonished, as a matter of fact, to have to speak to this man, one of the most learned men in the field of philosophy, regarding the law of excluded middle. Regarding things, it means that everything either has a property or it doesn't have it. Regarding propositions, it means that every proposition is either true or false. I submit to you there never has existed a thing that was neither human nor non-human. Stop and think about it. Think of a ridiculous idea that there were once things on earth that were neither human nor non-human. Now this is the best. It is not the weakness of the man. If they could bring someone else in, he would have no better answer. I assure you, the best man, as good as any in the world, is answering this question or attempting to do so. But he cannot tell you which was first, a woman or a baby, because he knows he cannot make it fit with evolution either way. Was there once a woman that was not ever a baby? Was there suddenly a woman just popped out of a log somewhere? Was there once a baby that was not born of a woman? Where did it come from? He has already said that no non-human thing transformed into being a human being, and no non-human thing ever gave birth to a human being. Dr. Flew, since you're under obligation to prove evolution, now prove, since it wasn't by transformation and it wasn't by birth, let's hear the way it was. Now, I tell you, friends, if ever a man has given up on a proposition, he has given up on this. The whole idea, it says, of a sharp line is not helpful. Now, that is simply not true. Human beings and non-human beings have a sharp line between them. Now, you don't have to know all about human beings and non-human beings to know that's so. You have no proof of shades of things of the kinds you allege, Dr. Flew. And he has beings which are neither human nor non-human, which has absolutely no basis in fact. Then he talks about objectivity of value and refers to Plato's dialogues. And he gives us the old medieval problem of raising the question, well, do you say that it is good because God approves of it, or does God approve of it because it is good? Now, you see, this is supposed to put you in the problem that if you say, well, God approves of it because it was good, then there is some law that is up above God. Here's God, you see, but up above God is a law. Well, that won't do, because then there's something greater than God. But if you say he approves, it's right simply because God approved of it, then you have something down here under God that was simply arbitrarily given by God. So that if he had wished, he could just as well have said that lying is good, and that fornication and adultery and murder and rape and all is just as good as what God has given us. Now, neither one of those will do, and they do not constitute a proper dilemma, because goodness goes to the ultimate good, who is God. Goodness flows from the very nature of God. It is not that God is under the good, nor that God is above the good, but that good flows from God. The will of God is the very essence, as it were, of the nature of God. That is, it is not under a law, and it is not above an arbitrary law. All right, thank you. Now, he then, in his statement, indicated that something ought to be done. He made reference several times to something or some things that ought to be done. Well, Dr. Flew, I would like to know what they are. Let us hear a list of some things that ought to be done, and how do you decide them? And then he talks as if goodness could be defined without reference to the will of God. Well, the way you have defined it by the answering of your questions, and actually in your writings, it is purely a function of a human mind. You remember the question. One time, there's nothing in existence but dead matter. I asked the question, before there was a human being, was there anything of value? He said no. That means it had to depend upon the human mind for there to be value. Therefore, Dr. Flew is saying, he's taking the emotive theory of ethics as a matter of fact. And if he holds that that is not the case, I'd like to hear him explain how it does not follow as I've explained. All right, now, since I've covered his entire speech, how much time do I have, please, sir? 9 minutes. All right, let us begin with chart number 6. Now, on chart number 6, which I'm introducing as negative material, I want to show that I have only to do one of these things to show that Dr. Flu's proposition is false. I have to establish only one of them. As a matter of fact, I've already established one of them, in that I have shown he's been guilty of self-contradiction. I've already established that his proposition is false by showing that he has given up on the only way he could establish it. One thing that is absolutely necessary to his case is to know that man has evolved and has not been created. But since creation and evolution are the only two possibilities, in reasoning by implication that evolution is out, he has admitted creation, and admitting creation, he has admitted God. Now notice on this chart, chart number 6, I'll take just a moment to turn to it. I have shown that on this chart I'm showing that Flu's proposition is false. I have only to do even one of these things. But I propose before the close of the last negative speech tomorrow evening to have accomplished them all. I've already accomplished some, as I've indicated. But first, his proposition and the total position which it involves self-contradiction. Now, it is a very frequent activity of atheists to charge theism with self-contradiction. It cannot be sustained, and when that point is introduced by the affirmative speaker, then we shall reply to it. But I have already shown that the atheistic position involves self-contradiction, and shall do more along that line. Secondly, there are some things which he must know in order to know that God does not exist, but which he cannot know. Does he know that matter is eternal? Does he know that at one time absolutely not one living cell, not one living thing was anywhere in all of the universe? Does he know that? Then let him tell us how he knows it. And that's just one of many, 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 and I'm sure could be listed into the thousands of things that he must know, but which he cannot know. Third, his position involves absurdities. And when you can reduce a proposition to an absurdity, when you can show that a proposition implies a false doctrine, then that shows that that doctrine itself is false. The argument in logic called modus tollens, which indicates that if you have an if-then proposition, if this is the case, then this follows. If you can show that what follows is false, then you have shown that what precedes is false. Now, what I'm saying is this: if such and such is the case, then this is the case. I can show that atheism involves absurdities, which proves that it itself is false. Then the proposition involves the denial of major undisputed facts. We'll be talking about that in detail. His proposition, if I can show that his proposition involves the use of at least one incoherent concept. Now, this has been Dr. Flu has touched on this tonight in hinting at the idea that the concept of God is incoherent. I'm anxious for him to really get into that, and then we have something ready for him on the idea that atheism involves incoherent concepts. Third, if I could show that, or sixth, if I could show that his efforts to defend his basic proposition have involved him in admissions of defeat. I do not mean that he came out and said, okay, I give up, but that his implications are involved in that. All right, now let us note, I want to go back over the material which I pointed out earlier in the first speech, just briefly, and then introduce some more material in connection with that. Let us look at chart number 10T. Dr. Flu may write these down, and they'll be given to him, supplied to him on the screen at any time he likes. Now, on this screen you will see the German Nazis by their activities against the Jews, by gas, by labor, by quicklime, by shooting, and so forth. Now, a Nazi would say, and they as a matter of fact did say, it was morally right for us to try to exterminate the Jews. The Jews say, however, it was morally wrong for the Germans to try to exterminate the Jews. Now, here you have two classes of people in the same nation, one of them saying, we're meeting our needs and desires, which, if I've understood him, is Dr. Flu's one of the ways he goes about trying to establish some sort of moral obligation. But the Jews take a rather dim view of that, and they say that doesn't exactly meet our needs and desires. And so, given Dr. Flu's basic position, it follows that the Germans were right and the Jews were right. And so the Germans were right in saying that it was morally right to destroy them, and the Jews said it was morally wrong to do it, and so you have a logical contradiction. Now let us note further in chart chapter 10, number 10U, in regard to the intended extermination of the Jews, Nazi Heinrich Himmler said, we had the moral right, we had the moral duty to our people to destroy this people, that is the Jews, which wanted to destroy us. The Nuremberg documents 1919-PS, quoted by Bullock in Hitler, A Study in Tyranny. Now then, therefore, according to the Germans, it was morally right, but the Jews said it was morally wrong. And Dr. Flew cannot say, really, that either one of them was wrong. Now let's look at chart number 10M. Dr. Flew wants to affirm oughtness, that human beings ought to act in certain ways, but by implication he denies it, as I've already shown. He wants to affirm that there is real objective right and real objective wrong, but by implication he has already denied both of those. He wants to say that Hitler and the Nazis really did objective moral wrong in the torture murder of 6 million Jews, but his basic position implies that as long as the Nazis emotionally approved, or if a majority approved, what they did was not really objectively wrong. Now let's turn over to chart number 43, number A11, 43A11. Now let's look at the Nazi solutions to what they call the Jewish problem. Dr. Flew, I would like for you to deal with this matter. Which of these things are right and which are wrong? To work them to death under unbearable conditions. Now here is a nation of people under the direction of their Führer, their leader, who have passed laws that actually make that the right thing to do in their sight. Secondly, subject them to inhuman dignities and then kill them, men, women, and children, in gas chambers. Not only to make them die, but to make them die in agony. That is, to put them in freight cars coated with quicklime, which, producing excruciating burns, required about 4 days to kill the victims. Robert Paine in The Life and Death of Adolf Hitler. Now, Dr. Flew, if you would check any of these as being actually really wrong, what law did they violate? Now, you said international law. But my friends, international law, the simply invention of another human law, would be back to say that that was, again, nothing more than the mere function of a human mind. It's happened to be human beings from several nations, to be sure, but that is not the basis upon which those people were tried and convicted, and it ought not to have been the basis upon which they were. Robert Jackson, prosecutor, said there is a higher law which transcends the provincial, the mere geographical area of a country, and a particular time in which it was involved. Let's look at chart number 43A12. How much time do I have? 1 minute. Let's look at this. The law of Germany. Over there to the left of the chart, you will see the law of Germany prior to 1933. The people of Germany are under it. There is moral degeneration. Follow the dotted line. To the people of Germany under the law of Germany in 1933, with the rise of Adolf Hitler, to 1945 with his demise. Now, moral progress to the people of Germany under the law of Germany in 1945 to the present. Now, I say there was real moral degeneration among the German people up to the time, or from the time, of the German nation taking its place as it rightly should in the family of nations in the time of the rise of the Nazis and the horrible things they did, and there was moral progress after that. But now notice, the law of Germany was judged by a higher law, by a standard which transcends the provincial, the geographical area, and mere time. Now, friends, there is absolutely no way you can hold that the accusations, the trials, the condemnations, and the punishments, even the executions of those men could be justified on the basis of a mere human emotion, a mere human approval. My time is up, and I thank you very much.
Today, Dr. A.G.N. Flew has held to the atheistic position in his affirmation, "I know that God does not exist." Dr. Thomas B. Warren has defended God's existence as the negative disputant. The Churches of Christ are not only committed to the existence of God, but are also committed to the restoration of New Testament Christianity. We invite you to visit our services. Any questions or comments concerning this debate are welcome.